George Groves will fight Jamie Cox in the quarterfinal of the World Boxing Super Series. It is an all-British clash. Cox is the guy that George Groves chose because George Groves was the #1 seed in the super middleweight version of the World Boxing Super Series. So he got to pick out of all the super middleweights who are in the tournament. He got to pick which one he would like to fight first. That's how they set up the initial stages of this particular tournament. He chose Jamie Cox. He said in an IFL interview the reason, and he was very candid about it, is because he sees Jamie Cox as the easiest fight. These guys are somewhat familiar with each other. They know each other from the amateurs. That's what George Groves said. I'm sure you're all very familiar with George Groves, but just for the sake of it, I'm going to give you a rundown on George Groves' statistics and Jamie Cox as well, who most of us are less familiar with. George Groves is 29 years of age. He's a super middleweight, obviously. He has had 29 fights, 26 wins, 3 losses, 2 of those losses by knockouts, and he scored 19 knockouts of his own. He is currently the WBA Super World Super Middleweight Champion. His alias is the Saint, George Groves. His most notable fights, I mean, he's been in there with very, very high-level competition, George Groves, it has to be said. His most notable fights were the 2 fights that he had with Carl Froch. He lost both of them. The first one controversially, but he gave a very, very good account of himself the first time around. His fight against James DeGale, which he won early on in his career, because DeGale's gone on to become a world champion, so that was a notable fight for him. His third world title challenge against Badou Jack, in which he lost on points by split decision. That was a very notable fight again. He put up a good account for himself in the Badou Jack fight. I know he was very disappointed, but I think it was a case of Badou Jack being underestimated, not only by George Groves, but also being underestimated by many of the boxing fans and the boxing establishment in general, because people were acting as though George Groves was just going to go over there and take candy from a baby against Badou Jack. But Badou Jack has definitely proven himself to be a far better fighter than we initially anticipated. Certainly a far better fighter than I initially suspected, sorry. So, I mean, you look at George Groves' performance against Badou Jack, and you can argue that he did better against Badou Jack than James DeGale did, in the sense that he took less punishment. Even though he lost the fight by split decision, he didn't get beat up the way James DeGale got beat up by Badou Jack. Anyway, he also fought Martin Murray, and in his last fight, he finally became a world champion by beating Fedor Chudinov in, how many rounds was that? Was it like 6 rounds, I think? So, yeah, there's George Groves for you. Now, moving over to his opponent, Jamie Cox. He's an interesting one. As I'm not sure if I mentioned, George Groves is from London. Most of you know that anyway. Jamie Cox is from Swindon, which is in Wiltshire in the United Kingdom. He is 30 years old, so he's actually a year older than George Groves. He's had 23 fights, 23 wins, 13 wins by knockout. He stands 5'11", so he's around the same height as George Groves. They're both around the same height. Super middleweight, obviously. Now, what's interesting about Jamie Cox, he's a southpaw fighter as opposed to George Groves, who's orthodox. What's interesting about him is that he started his career at welterweight back in 2007, Jamie Cox. 144 pounds he weighed for his pro debut. Very strange. This was 10 years ago when he turned pro. So he turned pro at 20. He was a welterweight. He's now 30 years old and he's a super middleweight. So I guess you can grow a fair amount during your career. But given the fact he's, I guess he was a very tall or pretty tall welterweight at 5'11". You can fill out. Kind of reminds me of Nathan Cleverly. He turned pro at like light middleweight, I think. And he ended up being a career light heavyweight. So, yeah, it's kind of interesting. He's had a stop-start career. Jamie Cox is undefeated, but he's had long stretches of inactivity. The most notable one was between 2011 and 2013. He didn't fight at all in 2012. And he's been, he was inactive quite a few times, during that period. So, yeah, he's had a stop-start career. Stylistically, let me talk about stylistically George Groves first. George Groves, stylistically, is a boxer-puncher. He has that kind of ambush style that came from Adam Booth, but I believe that his new trainer, Shane McGuigan, has been modifying that style. I think George Groves is more wily and crafty than he used to be in his younger days. But I think he's lost a lot of his explosiveness and sharpness. And that's, to me, part of what made him special in his younger days was that sharpness and that athleticism that he had. I think George Groves' athleticism has deteriorated quite significantly. Even though I think he's smarter, he paces himself better in fights and he can go the distance a lot better now than he used to. He just don't have that same dynamic, explosive athleticism that he used to have. And that does concern me a bit about George Groves. Again, he's a boxer puncher with a kind of an ambush style. Now, Jamie Cox, on the other hand, he's interesting. I've seen quite a few of his fights. He can box a little bit, but he has a tendency to be quite aggressive. He's a southpaw. 13 knockouts out of 23 fights. But the way that he loads up on shots, and he does have pretty good hand speed, the way that he loads up on shots, you know, if he catches George Groves clean, I'm sure he can hurt George Groves. Groves is not known for having an iron jaw. I think we all know that. He's been down and wobbled and hurt in numerous fights during his career. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if Jamie Cox was able to hurt George Groves. Cox, despite being older than Groves, to me looks the fresher fighter. You know, he hasn't taken the punishment that Groves has taken. He hasn't suffered the psychological problems, or hasn't had to get over the psychological scars that Groves has had to get over in his boxing career. You know, Jamie Cox, undefeated, never been knocked out. George Groves been knocked out twice and defeated again by Badu Jack. These are all psychological hurdles he had to get over. And he said very recently that he only really got over the Carl Froch defeats when he beat Chudanov. Completely from a psychological point of view. You know, that's if he even is over them at all. But that's what he says, that he only just got over them in the Chudanov fight. So, yeah, like I said, I get the impression that Cox is the fresher guy despite being 1 year older. You know, I think he might have even turned pro earlier than George Groves. I can't remember now. Let me just check when George Groves actually turned pro. Cox turned pro 2007. George Groves turned pro 2008. Yeah, so he actually turned pro earlier than Groves, and he's older than Groves, but he's had less fights than Groves. So it is an interesting dynamic. I want to know why Groves picked this guy, because he could have picked any number of the super middleweights out there in the tournament. For example, he could have picked Eric Skoglund. He could have picked Rob Brandt. Those are the unseeded boxers. On the left-hand side of the quarterfinal, you get the seeded boxers. Those are the guys who get to pick from the other unseeded fighters. I believe that's how it works. I don't think a seeded fighter can choose another seeded fighter. Maybe they can. I don't know. But certainly they can choose the unseeded fighters. George Groves chose to fight Jamie Cox, and he said that was the easiest fight in his opinion. Is Skoglund not an easy fight? Is Rob Brandt not an easier fight? I don't know. Maybe because it's the familiarity that he has with Jamie Cox. The fact that he's been in camp with him and, you know, he's familiar with him from the amateur days. Maybe he's not as familiar with Skoglund and Yildirim and Rob Brandt and the rest of the guys. Maybe that's why he'd rather choose the devil he knows than the devil he don't know. So, yeah, this is an interesting fight to me. Let me know who you think is going to win. How's the fight going to go? How highly do you rate Jamie Cox? He's been talked about on the British scene for a long time now as somebody who's very talented but has never yet fulfilled their potential. Will he shock George Groves and become the WBA Super Middleweight World Champion and progress to the semi-finals of this World Boxing Super Series tournament? You let me know what you think in the comment section below, people. How's this fight going to go down? What television station is going to show this fight? That's the next thing. You know, are all these fights going to be shown on Sky or Box Nation or on different stations in the UK or around the world? I'm not exactly sure how it's going to work. I'll be very interested to find out. So anyway, some food for thought for you there, people. So let me know how you feel about everything I talked about in the video. All right, it's happening. I'm out.